Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Edelle Field-Fote. I'm the Director of Spinal Cord Injury Research at the Shepherd Center, and I also have academic appointments at Emory University in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine and at Georgia Institute of Technology in the program in Applied Physiology. Today, it's my pleasure to talk with you a little bit about the standard of care in spinal cord injury rehabilitation in the United States. So I'll begin by sharing with you the usual course of care that an individual with spinal cord injury goes through after experience a traumatic SCI in the US. And then I'll talk about the different forms that therapy can take and how these vary over the course of an individual from their acute phase to their more chronic phase of injury. And then finally, I'll touch on how rehabilitation can influence the outcomes of experimental SCI interventions because it can have an important influence that sometimes could moderate the effects of the experimental intervention or actually be responsible for the effects of an experimental intervention. So to begin, in the United States, acute inpatient rehab is generally in one of two places. They are in inpatient rehab facilities or IRFs, or in long-term acute care hospitals. In the United States, there are 18 spinal cord injury model system centers. The majority of these, 14, are in inpatient rehabilitation facilities, and 2 of them are long-term acute care hospitals. And there are differences in the admissions criteria, in the reimbursement criteria, and the contents of therapy that people receive, depending on which facility type they're in. So in any type of inpatient rehab facility or long-term acute care hospital facility, the goal is to return the person to the community. And that has got to be accomplished as quickly as possible. So based on the information that's currently available from the National Spinal Cord Injury Statistical Center, information that comes from these 18 spinal cord model system centers, the lengths of stay are very short. And so a person with complete tetraplegia, the average length of stay is 52 days. Someone with incomplete tetraplegia, their average length of stay is 42 days. Complete paraplegia, 37 days, and incomplete paraplegia, 35 days. So just imagine the this very short amount of time that's available to be able to adapt to a new spinal cord injury, learn to use a wheelchair, learn to get in and out of bed, and learn to do all the things that are necessary in order to get back into the community within the lengths of stay that are allowable by insurance companies. After that acute inpatient stay, some people have access to post-acute SCI rehabilitation, but that access depends on the payer source. So a person with private insurance may have between 8 to 40 visits a year. If they're dependent on Medicare, there's a set annual amount. In 2025, this annual amount was $2,410 for physical therapy and speech language pathology combined. Now in spinal cord injury, so this is across the different types of neurologic conditions. So this includes individuals with stroke, brain injury. So in spinal cord injury, because most of the time individuals do not require speech language pathology services, they can have access to those funds for physical therapy. If additional time is needed, then the provider, the healthcare provider, has to appeal for additional dollars for continued care. And if the individual is on Medicaid, then it really depends on what state they live in because it varies widely state by state. Then after that period of time, there are self-pay rehab options in the chronic phase of spinal cord injury. This might include outpatient clinical services, wellness centers the individual may have access to, oftentimes on a fee-for-service basis, activity-based therapy programs, and home health. And these vary widely depending on the needs of the individual and the payer source. So when we think about rehabilitation, it's important to keep two different foci in mind. There's compensation versus restoration. So in the early stages after spinal cord injury, the goal has to be to get the individual back to their community and back to their home. And so very often the focus of rehabilitation is on compensation, being able to use devices, for example, to be able to use different types of splints in terms of hand function or braces for walking function. And the idea is that whatever is necessary to teach the individual to be self-sufficient in the home as much as possible is what is the focus of rehab. And then after that initial rehabilitation period, if the individual has access to continued services, very often the focus shifts from compensatory strategies to restoration. And this is where repetitive task practice training and use-driven plasticity really becomes important. So the idea of this use-dependent plasticity is that the nervous system learns which cells are active together. And we say in this concept of Hebbian plasticity, that cells that fire together wire together. And this plasticity is the basis for all skill development. And as we'll see in a moment, it's in the basis for memory as well. But it requires time and it requires practice. And so very often there isn't the time to be able to do this during the early stages of rehabilitation, where the individual has to get out of the hospital and be able to get back to their community. And so the early stages are focused on compensation, and later, if the individual has access to continued care, it may focus on restoration of hand function, restoration of walking function, and that type of thing. So just kind of as an example, I'm sure we've all had this experience. You park in this giant parking lot and you have to remember where your car is in order to get back to it after you finish shopping. And whether or not you actually remember where your car is depends on whether you actually actively think about where you parked. And you practice thinking about where you parked, what other cars were near you, what light poles were near you, and thinking about it actively is the only way that you can actually remember where you parked and get back to your car when you're done shopping. And that type of activity, that repetitive practice of thinking about where did I park, is the exact same type of mechanism that underlies repetitive skill training, whether it be hand function, walking function after spinal cord injury, or other skills like learning to play the piano, and those types of things that require repeated practice. So many factors influence our ability to be able to remember. And that's so important when we think about how this applies to rehabilitation. So just kind of recap what we were talking about. In acute rehab, the discharge timeline drives the focus of therapy. So the person has to focus on the skills needed for discharge, function in the home, mobility in their community, and the emphasis on compensatory strategies. And that very acute phase of rehabilitation may leave little time for things like hand training, walking training, mobility training that require neuroplasticity, which are really more restorative strategies. But when we think about the way clinical research is done, clinical research is very often done either in the acute phase of rehabilitation or in the more chronic phases of rehabilitation. And so they are done within the context of the rehabilitation that the individual is receiving. And so very often it's difficult to separate out the effects of the experimental intervention, whether it be a surgical, cellular, biologic, pharmacologic, or electrotherapeutic intervention, from the actual effects that come from rehabilitation, practice, and training. And so the key point is that clinical research occurs in the context of the real world of the rehabilitation that the individual is receiving after their spinal cord injury. And it's really important to be able to understand that these two things interact, and that there might be very complex interactions between the experimental intervention and the rehabilitation intervention. So, for example, if we look at these walking avatars of individuals with motor incomplete C4 neurologic level of injury, you see that they are very, very different in terms of their residual motor function. And because of that, they're going to have very different experiences in rehabilitation, despite the fact that they have similar neurologic levels of injury. And their experiences in rehabilitation are going to influence any experimental intervention that's done on top of the rehabilitation. And so to address this, we recently developed a physical therapy, occupational therapy basic data set that is intended to be used with experimental interventions when they are combined with rehabilitation. And this is to be able to get a sense of what is the potential impact that's due to the rehabilitation versus to the experimental intervention. I'll give you an example where I happen to be at Shepherd Center, where we have a very um, big emphasis on locomotor training for people for whom locomotor training is appropriate. And so we actually have a separate therapy team that people can be referred to if locomotor training is appropriate for them. And so they spend time during rehabilitation being able to receive this very intensive practice use dependent type of therapeutic intervention. I have another colleague at another institution where they really emphasize wheelchair skills. They emphasize the ability to make sure the person can get in and out of their wheelchair if they happen to end up on the ground. They emphasize the ability to go up and down curbs without curb cuts. And they really emphasize the ability to be an expert wheelchair user when the individual leaves their center. And so these are two institutions, very, very high level rehabilitation, but very different emphases in terms of what the individuals might receive depending on the institution that they happen to be in. And so you can see that if both of these centers are part of a multi-center study of an experimental intervention, there might be different outcomes in those two centers that really have nothing to do with the experimental intervention and have more to do with the rehabilitation that intervention was combined with. So I hope that this has given you some sense of the basics of rehabilitation after spinal cord injury in the United States, differences between compensatory strategies that are needed often early after spinal cord injury to get the individual out of the hospital or rehabilitation center and into the community, versus more restorative strategies that require high levels of practice, repetition, and a lot of time to be able to gain skill at different types of functional behaviors. And then how these different emphases, rehabilitation approaches focusing on compensatory strategies versus rehabilitation strategies, might interact with an experimental intervention in a way that could influence the outcomes of those experimental interventions. So thank you for sharing your time with me today, and I hope that you enjoy the conference. Thank you.